In the United States of America, there is a growing problem with overpopulation and poverty. This issue can directly be seen on the streets of Seattle, Washington, which are littered with homeless people in homeless camps. Society calls for action and is crying out for a solution to the epidemic of welfare and drug abuse, which can be directly related to the issue of poverty. It is with this thought in mind that people begin to consider outlandish resolutions. To decrease the hardships that have been forced on this country, they begin to look at the source of the issues. Perhaps people consider if women who are not productive to society are made barren, then there will be no further burden to the government. There will be no one producing too much children that cannot be taken care of properly. Unaware that sterilization has already been experimented with, these individuals are doomed to repeat the past. Sterilization is not the answer to our problems in a plethora of ways. While the thought of sterilization seems rash and unreasonable, there are ways to justify the means. But first, let's discuss a little bit about where sterilization and the history of the idea came from. Sterilization is a product of eugenics, which is described as the idea that humans can improve the quality of the population through man-made interventions. A common example of eugenics was Hitler's attempt to create his master race of Aryans. While this example may sound extreme, the United States of America had in fact adopted this way of thinking in the early 1900s, even while the Holocaust was taking place. Sterilization in North Carolina occurred from 1929 to 1973 and originated in the attempts to eliminate children birthed from the institutionalized mentally ill and mentally deficient. People who were deemed unsafe to bear children were sterilized through a governing board called the Eugenics Board, which was established in 1933. Although the Eugenics Board was given a great power, which seemed to be for the good of the population, it came with a great responsibility, which would ultimately be abused. What began as a way to protect impaired people from parenthood who would become seriously handicapped if they were to assume parental responsibilities quickly turned into something more sinister and racist. The University of Vermont notes the first adaptation to the standing guidelines was to begin sterilizing women who were not only mentally impaired, but also considered subnormal intellectually. The reason for this was to prevent poor and unfit women from reproducing children with mental or social ills. They were generally ordered for sterilization by social workers who lived outside of the institutions. The poor were not only targeted for their social ills, but also because they were easier to sterilize. They would often not be released until they or a family member agreed to have them sterilized. The public feared that if bloodlines from these less than intelligent females contaminated the public, it would interfere with the progression of the human race. At that time, in states like North Carolina, there was a large number of humans who endured poverty, which hindered their ability to actually educate themselves. A particular group who found it hard to perform well on IQ tests were African Americans, and thus would be ultimately targeted. Despite only making up 60% of North Carolina's population, overall by the later 1960s, 60% of those sterilized would be young black women. The University of Vermont describes how there were false discussions about African Americans being the predominant users of welfare and having the most illegitimate children, which fostered fear and anger from the government and taxpayers. After World War II, during the Great Depression, it became important to lessen the burden of welfare, and to do this, North Carolina deemed it appropriate to begin targeting African Americans on welfare for sterilization. By doing so, they reasoned the government would have less mouths to feed and shelter. Women as young as 14 would be forced to undergo tubal ligation due to a family history of illegitimate children and possible rape. What happens if they refused? The government threatened to remove all welfare contributions to the family. With such a vast ability to frighten and threaten the public, the Eugenics Board and its social workers were able to negatively impact a great many of innocent women with its abuse. While the situation in North Carolina was bleak, another population of women were being forcibly sterilized to more extreme outcomes. The author, Catherine Andrews, states between 1930 and 1970, one-third of the Puerto Rican female population who were able to bear children were sterilized through less than admirable means. Similar to North Carolina, it is suspected that these sterilizations were encouraged due to economic poverty and the thought that less population would equate a wealthier civilization. Another economic reason was that Puerto Rico's income stemmed from the manufacturing of textiles, which could not be as productive if women were at home tending to their children. After consideration, the government reasoned it would be better to have women with innate birth control. The U.S. government began sending health department officials to rural parts of the island, advocating for sterilization. Instead of improving the overall quality of life for Puerto Ricans, 21% of women felt some regret for having the operations and 11% felt definite regret for having been sterilized, which ultimately does not promote a happy, healthy country. Sterilization of Latinas was not solely limited to the Puerto Rican population, but also affected women in America, mainly California. Latinas from California were pressured to undergo procedures to become sterilized and would later press charges against the governing boards who authorized these surgeries. The case of Madrigal versus Qualigan was a federal class action lawsuit in which these women fought back for having been sterilized without informed consent or while under duress. Some women claimed that they did not know the procedure that was happening would leave them barren. Due to voluntary consent not being legal until the 1970s, the judge would deem this emotional upset as a miscommunication due to language barrier, and no compensation was awarded. This proves that not unlike the African Americans, a group of minorities was targeted again by the government and was made sterile by less than admirable. Sterilization did not work for Adolf Hitler, the United States of America, or Puerto Rico. It is with both the African American and the Latina history in mind that we make a stance against sterilization. This is a piece of American history that is not well known due to the deplorable actions made against these women, and in some cases, even children. Despite attempts at eugenics in Puerto Rico, it is not a flourishing, wealthy country, and welfare is still abused in most states of America. If given the power to take away the gift of life from women, the government would certainly abuse its responsibilities again. Instead of people callously considering neutering the poverty-stricken population, it's time civilization pulls together to find a humane resolution to our countrywide problems. Thank you very much.